I'm very happy to have Selmer here, presenting some of his substantial work on AGI. And take it away, Selmer.
Thank you, Chris. You're probably the first person who ever got my name right earlier when you pronounced it in my career so far. No one's ever pronounced my last name correctly. So that's pretty interesting. Okay, so let me start my stopwatch. And here we go. So first, the demos that you see later in the presentation, none of this would be possible without the support of a number of sponsors, and in my case, two in particular are most relevant to what I'll be talking about today, and that's the John Templeton Foundation and AFOSR, as it's known in the States. And then in addition, I'm really honored to be here, and thank you so much. An enumeration is not necessary, but thank you so much to everyone who made this possible. All right, so you'll be getting your serious dose of logic today, since you got a lot of that from Pei, and I'll give you some here as well, but I'll try to embed this within suitably controversial territory so that we can have some debate about this. During the time I present here directly, if you do have questions of clarification, I'd be happy to take them, but if they start running counter to the basic recipe that Chris gave, that is discussion after the 10-minute break, then probably that's not such a great idea. All right, so in this audience, I probably don't need to go through any diagnostics talking about sort of a basic ability to do logic and what is logic. So I'm going to zoom right through this, but there's a reason why I'm a fan of logic, and that's because it's quite powerful. As Pei mentioned, it's quite old. Aristotle was doing it over 2 millennia ago. We're still going strong in doing it for many, many reasons, and I'm just going to throw this list up here. In terms of its invincibility, since you would have to give presumably a rational argument against logic, you'd end up using logic to do it, and for that reason, logic, it is said, is invincible. A key to riches, because at least in the States, you don't get a loan automatically. Maybe it's easier in Iceland. So you have to make a rational case for getting a loan or for getting investment, and you better use logic to do that. So it goes on and on and on, but these are the two things that I'm going to focus on today. So generally, mere animals can't do things that we usually think warrant use of logic to model, right? And secondly, it's a very powerful way for modeling, simulating, and arguably replicating intelligence, or at least human intelligence, or perhaps you'll agree a part of human intelligence. So those are the two things we'll focus on. Now, humans, it is said, aren't good at logic. This is not true. Humans are very good at logic. Depends simply on whether they've had sufficient training. So there are these illusions out there, and I'm just going to throw a couple at you. We don't need to spend any great time on them. But this is a problem about a king and the ace. And let you take a look at that. Most people, when they see this problem, answer by saying there's an ace in the hand. The fact of the matter is that it's the opposite, and I don't recall whether this was in the paper that I encourage students to read, but in fact, what you can infer is that there isn't an ace, and we won't take time to go through the proof, but this is classical logic and the kind of thing I do just to see where we stand, because you do have to have some background in logic to understand what I'm going to be talking about. We'll skip that formal proof. This is another instance of a puzzler that was given to me by the psychologist Johnson Laird, who doesn't think human beings know how to use logic in any rigorous, deep sense. So you're given the following clues. If one of the following assertions is true, then so is the other. One is there's a king in the hand if and only if there's an ace in the hand. The second one is that there is a king in the hand. And then you're asked which is more likely to be in the hand if either the king or the ace. Now, I like to take these kinds of problems, if you did the required reading, quote required, and try to figure out how proposed AI systems can solve them. So I don't know how NARS would do this kind of thing, but I'm sure it could do it. This is not a difficult problem for most logic-based AI systems. The answer here, you'd need some pencil and paper and you'd need some time. The answer is that the ACE is in fact more likely, and we can prove this. And I won't go through the proof. The proof is a proof by cases. There are 4 cases to consider based on basic truth tables. So we'll now move to the first sort of controversial claim that I'm espousing. The kind of things you just saw, everybody in here can solve with sufficient time, motivation, and so forth, are not the kind of things that mere animals can solve. So I have no problem accepting this first part of the continuum there, going from rats to monkeys. I have no problem with the extreme optimism that even singularists show in terms of what a computer or a robot can do. I think that behavior is all within reach. However, it gets a lot more challenging when we're talking about persons, and that's the core topic of what I'm talking about today, persons or personhood. There, I'm not even sure that evolution gives us a very good explanation for how in the world this ever happened. That's a separate discussion. The co-discoverer of evolution by mutation and natural selection, Wallace, never agreed with Darwin on this because he couldn't see how the brain that we have, allowing us to do these kinds of problems that I just flashed here, and also allowing us to do the kind of things that I mentioned when Pei was speaking earlier in the area of infinitary reasoning. He couldn't see how those things had any evolutionary value for, say, 100, 200,000 years ago when we're talking about hunter-gatherers. But that's my basic picture for what AI has very little problem with and what AI has a huge problem with. And I'm including under AI, AGI. That's the challenge. Now, despite this challenge, there is a tremendous amount of optimism about AI and AGI. So going back to '85, this was my first AI textbook. This is a quote out of the textbook. This, by the way, was in a time, revealing my age here, this was at a time when you did AI, you did logic. The two are the same. So if you go and get this book here, the only formalism in the entire book for doing all of AI in 1985 was first-order logic. Things have changed, but the optimism has not. You see what the aim is here. Just build a person. Now, here's someone who unfortunately died recently, but whose work on AI does, I think, intersect in interesting ways with yours, Pei. But he told me at one of the dinners that we were lucky enough, that I was lucky enough to have with him, oh, don't worry, the ultimate goal of AI is to build a person, and my system, Oscar, is very close to being a person. And this was in 2004. And we can go on. In 2003, John Anderson said that Alan Newell's program is just going along very smoothly. This is a program essentially to build an artificial person. So these things are said. Then we also have the recent successes that AI has produced. We have Deep Blue, which I'm sure you all know about. We have Watson, which probably to this date is the greatest success story in the history of AI. In fact, in polling that IBM did before they launched the project, the illustrious AI folks who they brought in for a guess as to whether this would be possible or not said invariably no, at least not within your lifespan, and they did it in short order. But then we have people making amazing claims about brain simulation. Markram did this in his TED Talk. He said he'd be back the following year after the brain had been completely simulated and he could have a brain give the talk. And then we have this notion of the singularity, a prophecy that AI that equals human intelligence is soon to arrive. And once that happens, AI plus, that is AI smarter than human intelligence, will arrive. And that'll be so smart that it'll be able to create AI plus plus, and then we go on instantly forever, and that's the singularity. So there's a lot of optimism. Now, how about if we just step back and ask, what is a person? Before we agree with all this optimism, let's take stock of the kind of attributes that are core to being a person to see if we can gauge how difficult it will be to render them in computational terms. So here's my list. The list varies a little bit, but for the most part, these are the kind of things that look to be at the kernel of what you are. You can make choices and decisions, set plans and projects. You're conscious. You can experience love, passion, gratitude, etc. The nice meal we just had caused a sensation of, oh, that's what it's like to have this kind of rich Icelandic gravy with my chicken. So there's an experience there that we would call a quail, or in the plural, qualia. You're self-conscious. You're aware of your own states of mind. If you go into a sensory deprivation tank, things don't stop. You may be totally motionless. You may have no sensory experience whatsoever, but you can have a very robust internal life. You can communicate through a language, and by this term I mean natural language, which I'm doing right now. You know things and you believe things, and in the case of persons, this can go at least to the fifth order. So you believe that I believe that Iceland is north of, say, New York. And I believe that you believe that I believe that Iceland is north of New York. And that's 3 levels. That's probably more than a monkey, say, can manage, but we can continue. And that's a hallmark of personhood as well. Desire not only particular objects and events, but also you can desire changes in your personality or your character or your inclinations. And then finally, we can do some amazing things in the reasoning arena, which is what's very relevant to today, and I claim we can do infinitary reasoning. I discussed this in a small book that you would think would have very little to do with AI, but when you're talking about ethical issues that are sufficiently... Thank you. Thank you. Is this not show? Oh, this is in case I didn't have this guy?
It's in case this doesn't show very well up on the...
Oh, use this instead. Very good. So, double-barreled. Okay. So actually, the book does have relevance because it does contain something like that definition. Now let's look at these attributes here. Those, I think, we pretty much have to cross out because we have no idea how to mathematize consciousness. So we have no idea how to come up with a third-person mathematical account of that which it's like to taste deep, rich Icelandic gravy with roast chicken. We know that that's key. In fact, the only reason we want to continue to exist is that we want to continue to enjoy consciousness, but we have no mathematical account of it. And in this paper, I issue a challenge. If anybody thinks they can build a robot that has this, fine, I'll give you $1 billion, but you have to be honest. You can't just take the money from a funding organization. Also, there's communication in natural language. Now here, if we're honest, we have to face up to the fact that a smart toddler in 2012 is more powerful than any machine on the planet. A smart toddler can actually debate you. They can argue with you and debate you spontaneously. No machine can do that. So we probably should focus on the other attributes, but let me just say, if we do talk about natural language, since that's such a vibrant part of AI, along with Naveen Sundarji, I do have a starting observation that's relevant to the conversation that we were just briefly having back at lunch, and that is we want to say that if you are honest about natural language, you have to admit that it's loaded with what are called intentional operators. So for my money, the key observation is that natural language communication makes use, sometimes in one and the same sentence, of multiple intentional operators. Now in logic, intentional operators are things that allow us to handle, if we look at this sentence here, Jones intends, it's everything underlined, Jones intends to convince Smith to believe that Jones believes that were there a cat lying in the foyer now to be let out, it would settle dozing on the mat. I mean, these are the kind of things that we find in natural language, where we read novels written by people like Proust, for example, and know exactly what we're reading. So everything underlined is a bit of a challenge in logic. It looks like if you were going to model this sentence using what's off the shelf for the most part in the history of logic, you'd be dealing with something like this, and you don't even have any quantification here. So you're not saying something like, everyone intends to convince Smith. If you said that, you'd have to start the thing with some kind of quantifier. So just to zero in on the things that are relevant here, here are the intentional operators. Believes, believes. I think this is common knowledge. I'm not sure. Then, and this is intents. A scope term. And then we don't have a material conditional. I'm not entirely sure what your conditionals are, but in English and all natural languages, we have many conditionals. The material conditional is just one from at least, at this point, after over 2 millennia, 15 well-defined, if we say formal work does that, conditionals. Now this is a subjunctive conditional, right? So this is, if this were to happen, then this would happen. That is not the material conditional. So that's what it looks like. This is very difficult, and this is what the Templeton Foundation has given us some money to pursue. But really, for today, let's sum it up by saying, where does this leave us? Turing was a brilliant person. It's the Turing Centenary. I participated in that. So did some of my graduate students. I would not say that Turing was linguistically enlightened. He predicted by the year 2000 this would be a done deal. We're over a decade past that, and it's not like it's around the corner. Okay? If you can find someone to take your wager that the Turing test in its unrestricted form won't be passed by 2050, I strongly advise you to take that. I know I'll never be paid back for all these wagers I have made with people, but at 53, I really should be wealthy if I could collect on these bets. What about today's talk? Let's just leave the natural language processing topic as a bracketed challenge in AI, because that could take up all our time. Right? So now back to the overall picture to set the stage for this logic-based work that I'm talking about. Now here is my overall picture. This is from a very high level how I view the human mind. This circle here captures all parts of the 3 categories that contribute to being a person. One, over here we have this notion of subjective awareness or phenomenal consciousness, including self-consciousness, all in the same box, and we don't have a way to mathematize that. That which we don't have a way to mathematize or formalize is very hard to render in a working computer program. So that's a challenge. I think that humans hypercompute, and I'm not alone in this. Fortunately, by the way, everything in this box here is ultimately just a function from the natural numbers to the natural numbers, which is generally the landscape for computability theory. Regardless of what your views are on the mind, that's just what it is. And that's the arithmetic hierarchy is based on that focus. So hypercomputation is something more than what a Turing machine can muster, and this is the dividing line between the Turing machine and the machines that are above it. They're still information processing devices. None of them have been built yet, but the mathematical terrain is getting richer as I speak, with more and more devices specified. So we know a lot about this territory up here, and I just happen to believe that part of what humans do, that's this right here, can only be suitably modeled by machines up in this territory. So if we can't build them, we can't program them yet to accomplish anything real, but that's part of my view. Animals all fall down here, and so do people, at least in terms of this part of the pie. So this is the sweet spot for doing work in AGI or AI at present, and that's what I'll be talking about. So given the context I've now set, which is deflationary, how do we go about doing AI? Well, there are various ways of doing it, but I'm here giving the logic-based cheerleading presentation. I've been preceded by pay, and that's wonderful. And here's the basic idea. Strong AI would be the view that you can literally replicate, okay, a person. Weak AI is the idea that, look, whatever behavior you want to focus on, whatever behavior you think is impressive in the human case, there's a way to simulate it, to at least to a high degree, if the engineering is good enough. And in this case, moreover, you have to let the engineering be guided by a concrete test. So if you give me some money to do AI research, I won't take it unless the outcome can be defined by way of a test that the thing which I, with my grad students and colleagues, are going to engineer can pass a well-defined test. Otherwise, I'll feel guilty in taking the money. And then to do it, we'll make use of computational logic. And here I'm 100% on board with Pei. When I talk about computational logic, buried in there is the notion that this has to be executable. This has to be able to be implemented. So this is the idea. A little bit more in the direction of the test orientation, simply what you would expect, though here I'm saying we should piggyback on probably the greatest success story in the history of the cognitive sciences, and that is psychometrics. We've made a lot of progress in being able to measure intelligence and other mental attributes in the human sphere, and so we probably should leverage that. At least that's my claim. Okay, so here's the approach: design and engineer intelligence systems relative to tests via logic-based AI. And so we're doing AI and computational cognitive modeling of this sort. This was the paper that I encouraged students to read. I only selected this one. There was just one, but if you want a more opinionated one about the relationship between AI and logic overall, there's this one. I think that at this point we probably should just let the part of AI that's concerned with logic go off and be its own field, instead of this persistent ecumenical attitude that we see in AI, where everybody's got to exist under the same umbrella, and this doesn't always work. As a third paper that I think is a nice introduction and very, very readable to my approach, there's this one in IEEE Intelligent Systems. This paper, as you can tell from its title, pertains to the attempt to engineer robots guaranteed not to behave ethically in unethical fashion. So very relevant probably in light of what science fiction predicts we're looking at in the future of warfare. Now, it's important to realize that when I'm talking about using logic in AI, and I'm not entirely sure what Pei's attitude would be about this, but historically, it's always been based on one logic or two logics. And if you pick up the dominant textbook in AI, which is the Russell and Norvig book, the book that gave rise to the first MOOC with something like 60 or 100,000 students, all using, I believe, that same book. It's a great book, but in one sense, unfortunately, the book is a travesty because it gives the distinct impression to students of AI that, oh, this logic stuff for AI is all propositional calculus and predicate calculus, or first-order logic. And this is very bad. This would be like telling a mathematician, please continue to advance the field of mathematics, but the only thing we're allowing you to use in order to do that is, say, topology. So we're saying one branch of mathematics defines the whole branch. That's about what it would be like. So the better approach is to take account of the reality that we see in the case of humans. Humans operate in ways that range across an infinite number of logical systems. Why do I say it's infinite? Well, unless you assume the human race is going to go extinct sometime soon, we just keep inventing new logical systems, and we just keep inventing new branches of mathematics with no stop in sight. And so that's why I say it must be infinite. So we need a formal theory of this and a corresponding set of processes that captures the meta-coordination of all these logical systems. So here we have the space of logical systems. The ellipses appearing in there indicate that this goes on, and I've already said it's infinite. So I've got NARS in here, okay? I've also got the propositional calculus. I've got Aristotelian logic, which in its pure form is the theory of the syllogism. But I've also got some other things in here. I've got visual logics. There's an entire branch of logic that pertains not to symbolic representations, but homomorphic representations or analogical representations. That's probably an unfortunate descriptor, but they're visual. Okay? You probably have noticed most of the logics, if not all the logics you've seen so far, they don't seem to use any pictures. And yet, if you look at the notebooks, even of human mathematicians, you see pictures used all the time. So what happened? What happened is the traditional thing in the history of AI. It just looked too hard to take account directly of human cognition, so we steered clear of that. But we have to stop that, and I'm glad to say it is gradually changing. Infinitary logics, so these are logics that, for example, allow expressions that are infinitely long. These were generally born in response to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, because his incompleteness results don't phase infinitary logics. Even small infinitary logics are not phased. Logic is a much bigger field than mathematics. The reason being, very simply, that classical mathematics is derivable from a few axioms which are all expressible in first-order logic. So when people study logic and get far enough along, they learn axiomatic set theory, and again, all of classical mathematics is derivable from it. So this is much larger than classical mathematics. Now, in the case of the ethical robot, or the would-be ethical robot, we need to draw from this category. These are logics about knowing and believing, etc. We need first-order logic. We also need logics of ethics and obligation. So in the work that I've done there and hope to continue to do, you need that part of the large space. You have to combine logics of ethics with logics of knowledge and belief. And I agree with Pei 100% that there's much more than deduction going on here, but logic has made a contribution to all of these forms of reasoning already. So there's deduction, induction, abduction. I think we saw these three in Pei's talk. Then analogical reasoning, which arrives on the scene later in your hierarchy. Then there's creative reasoning, which I won't take the time to define, but humans are very good at this. Humans actually just invent hypotheses and scenarios and stories to account for what they find in remarkable ways, and there's probabilistic reasoning, etc. So, we're returning to our list here, okay, in terms of personhood. These are the three that I want to tell you a little bit more about in connection with applied work that I have done. So we're looking in the area of self-consciousness, in the area of knowledge and belief, and iterated knowledge and belief, and then in the area of reasoning. And I want to end by telling you about Goodstein's theorem, which moves in the direction of infinitary reasoning. Oh, I just realized, do you have sound here? Sorry that I have a sound. I've got a bunch of demos that we probably should hook the sound up to. If it's a problem, I will run them, and I'll put this. You might be able to hear it if I put this up here.
While you run, I'll see if I can get this up.
Yeah, I think I'm increasing the volume. Well, we'll see with the first one. Okay. The adage in academia, at least in the States, is publish or perish. You've heard this. Maybe you've heard demo or die. If I had to pick between the two of them, at least in terms of funded AI work, I would say demo or die is the more serious stricture. So number one, to know and believe things. One piece of work I'm doing is to build an artificial conductor. So in this case, the system's name is Handel. That's the agent. To my knowledge, though, AI is focused on building systems that generate music. No one's tried the artificial conductor approach, so I figured, what the heck. Now, in this case, we use logic to allow Handel to read commentary, analysis, and suggestions about music. I already said I would bracket the NLP problem, so I'm not going to spend any time on this. We use a form of grammars called CCGs, which allow us to make a connection to lambda expressions. And if you look at the definition of the syntax here for our sorts, you'll see that we say the meaning of a musical phrase corresponds to a lambda expression. So that happens for Handel. And then the other part of Handel takes account of the fact that in music, this is, by the way, all based on, we had a brief conversation about music at lunch. This is all classical music from my standpoint, but the people on the grant and actually the PI, they have an avant-garde jazz perspective, but for me it's classical. So a conductor has beliefs about performers, spectators or the audience and composers, and they all have beliefs about each other. So it's very, very robust. And for that we use the cognitive event calculus invented by Konstantin Arkutis and me. And so we have lots of, you notice if you can see it, the black or the bolded text here. We have a bunch of intentional operators that we allow as first-class citizens, and that's the rules of inference. This is the syntax, and really, in some sense, that's the logic right there in terms of your categories of formal grammar and proof theory. And so this is how we get the music calculus, which we've promised to the National Science Foundation. Handel is, in fact, based on his namesake, Handel. I'm a Handel fan, Handel. Let's see what happens if we actually try to start to run this. Who knows?
Setting options for Handel. Setting performer skill level to beginner. Setting performance context to casual. Setting desired tempo to andante.
Now, I'm not going to play all of these videos. We won't have the time. But the important thing is that, in this case, 3 of the same pieces from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier are going to play. And Handel is going to offer analysis and suggestions after 2 iterations until in the 3rd time the musician gets it about right, according to Handel. We're not going to spend the time listening to this. Tempo is changed, loudness is changed, etc., and it's all based on logic. So this notion that logic can't be rapid and dynamic, or that it can't be responsive to things that are as subtle as music or not, is not true. The wise man puzzle was in the reading. 3 wise men are told they have fezzes, which are black or white, and they have to figure out which one they have. In fact, they're all white. They're going to get some major prize, or they're going to avoid being imprisoned for the rest of their lives. This is something that you have to do if you do logic-based AI. You have to show that you can do it well. We've done it for the infinite case. So this is going to slide over. And so for any size wise man puzzle, we've shown how you could do this quickly and efficiently. We can do this in robots and still do it fast enough. So these are 3 simple robots. I've steered clear of, for the most part, robots in my presentation. I have a lot of robots in my lab. But these are 3 wise men. In the case of the colors, I've got it reversed. They all 3 have black fezzes. And these 2 wise men here are going to say they can't tell which one they're wearing. And there's a macabre element to this. You die if you give the wrong answer. So you've in fact all been poisoned, corresponds to wearing the black fez. And the final robot is going to get it right. That's how we're going to skip them. This is one that the media had a field day with. Unfortunately, this is the false belief task, which is taken by logically oriented people to be confirmation of the fact that human beings naturally develop an ability to reason logically, but people on the other side of the fence have different explanations. Eddie's in the center, and if you're not familiar with the false belief task, I won't let the whole thing play. I'll just give you a brief explanation. This is in Second Life from quite a while ago. Eddie's going to see that the bear is placed, I believe, in box A, and Eddie knows that Micah over here also sees the teddy bear be placed in box A. Then Micah's going to leave, and then the teddy bear is going to be moved from box A to box B, which is over here. And then Micah's going to come back, and Eddie's going to be asked the key question, which is asked of young children in the false belief test or task. Where will Micah try to get the teddy bear from if he's asked to retrieve it? Okay? If you haven't seen this before, do you get the basic logic of it? Okay? Micah doesn't know that the thing's been removed, so children before the age of 4 or 5 actually say that Micah will look in box B. And I think this is an instance of this being a failure. We can model failure and we can model success. Another thing that's not well understood about logic-based AI and computational and cognitive science is that it doesn't matter whether it's normatively correct or not, All that matters is that it's structured enough and that there's reasoning. If we can model it, we can model failure or success. So we won't go through the whole thing. This involved direct access to Linden Labs' systems a number of years ago. They're still in existence, by the way. They may be looking to diversify. But there you see the bear has been moved to B, and when Micah comes back, which is going to be in a very uncoordinated landing when that does happen, Eddie is going to say that Micah, who will be standing over here, is in fact going to look in box B. And there was the call for Micah to come back, and Micah's going to show up here, and you'll notice what I mean about it not being a particularly dexterous landing. And then Eddie gets the question. So we've done this. Got a response at MIT when I presented the first version of this. I'm not going to use any names, but I was told we've done that here at MIT, but we used an animal agent, a robot with fur, etc. And I said, well, just show me the math on that, because the idea is not to do a canned demo. The idea is to have a formal theory for how this will work in the general case. That is, in fact, what's called for in Goodman et al., and that's what we did. Perfectly general includes a full general account of time and change, courtesy of the event calculus under the hood, efficiency through what are called proof methods or proof tactics. Humans don't reason from scratch when they're faced with problems. They store previous solutions. So this notion that logic is slow reflects a complete misunderstanding of how human beings do logic. Now that Fermat's last theorem is done, we don't keep doing a revolutionary proof of Fermat's last theorem. We just take the theorem now and do other things. And if we need to, we remember a template for how the proof worked so that we can recreate it quickly. That's in that paper. So, number 2, what about self-consciousness? This is very recent work and involves this character, Kojito, who I'll let talk for himself.
This is Kojito, a semi-virtual character who in a few moments will be subject to the mirror test for self-consciousness. What you're looking at right now is Kojito's 3D avatar being reflected off a mirror. Kojito is actually being displayed on this laptop screen, which also contains a camera through which Kojito can look at the real world. On this other side, we have an extra screen through which we can look at Kojito's internal thinking in this window and output from Kojito's visual processing systems in this space. Even though Kojito is visible, he's not really awake. So let's wake him up, put him through the test, and see if he passes.
Hello there, how are you?
We are good, Kojito. Here we can see that Kojito has recognized himself in the mirror.
Asserting the mere physics axiom. Asserting the imitation axiom. I now know that the other agent is my reflection. Subproof follows the law. And it's subproof. I am seeing a red dot on the forehead of the agent in front of me. Calling the SNORP automated theorem prover to prove that I believe that I myself now have a red splotch on my forehead. SNORP prove that I believe that I myself now have a red splotch on my forehead. I do not want the splotch. I intend to not have the splotch. And it's subproof. I now intend to wipe my forehead, removing the splotch. Subproof by event calculus. Planning follows the law. And it's subproof. I am going to remove this splotch.
Wow, Kojito has passed the test.
This, of course, is the mirror test for self-consciousness, which apparently very few animals can pass. I think chimpanzees, elephants, dolphins, maybe that's it. I might be missing a few. But Kojito has passed. This is obviously stilted language. This gives you his internal monologue. And just to continue with that, I'll run through this one here. Gives more details on how he's doing this.
Mere physics axiom. Asserting the imitation axiom. I am now waving to my left. I see the other agent waving to my left. I am now waving to my right. I see the other agent waving to my right. I now know that the other agent is my reflection. Subproof follows below. And it's subproof. I am seeing a red dot on the forehead of the agent in front of me. Calling the SNARP automated theorem prover to prove that I believe that I myself now have a red splotch on my forehead. SNARP prove that I believe that I myself now have a red splotch on my forehead. I do not want the splotch. I intend to not have the splotch. And it's subproof. I now intend to wipe my forehead, removing the splotch. Subproof by event calculus. Planning follows below. And it's subproof.
There you have it. This Cogito work was made possible by Naveen Sundarji. The handle stuff I should have mentioned is made possible not only by Naveen, but by someone in my lab who knows a lot about music, and other PhD students, Simon Ellis. So anyway, that's where Cogito stands at the moment. Cogito is going on to a robot, so this can be done physically, and some of those initial experiments have taken place. In terms of how we do this, by the way, technologically, this is a bit of a beast. These are the systems that are used. They are all tied together by automated theorem proving. This is part of the reason why you have to have money to do these things. These are the programming languages that are used to make this. There's other work, but I gave you just 2 demos. And then in terms of modules, we have the ones that are scrolling out there now in front of you. And then giving you some sense of the interconnectivity between them. This is basically how it works. Now, in terms of the logic, it's infinitely cleaner. There's the CEC star now, that's the cognitive event calculus, ramped up to allow for self-concepts and reasoning about yourself. As far as I know, it's the only computational logic system that is multi-sorted, that's fully intentional, and that is able to, this is key, account for a distinction between different kinds of belief. Only de se belief is belief about yourself. And there's a long literature in the history of philosophy of mind about why beliefs about yourself, why that's radically different than beliefs about the external world. If you woke up here in some room at RU and it was pitch black and you had amnesia and you couldn't feel anything, you could still internally say things like, you know, I believe I'm unhurt. I don't feel any pain. You say, don't remember who your parents are, what you did for a living, or if you were still a student, that you were a student, but you can do all kinds of self-ascription that is divorced entirely from the physical environment and doesn't have any sensory component at the time. Those are de se beliefs. Most of this is described in a forthcoming paper. I don't know where it is, actually. Naveen would know. So Naveen, if you're looking a year later and get this, you can send me an email. Tell me where this paper went. But some journal has this paper. And now number 3, to end things, let's look at human reasoning from the standpoint of logic-based AI and cognitive science. This can get boring fast, because this is what AI has been doing since its inception. In 1956, when AI, quote, started at Dartmouth, this was the kind of thing that they were impressed with. Logic theorists showed up at Dartmouth and stole the show, and that was really just a primitive theorem prover. Okay, this is not the challenge that we're talking about, which is why Goodstein's theorem is highlighted here. So let me give you my conjecture about infinitary reasoning. This is very much related to Isaacson's conjecture, and I put that in scare quotes because Isaacson did not actually explicitly issue this conjecture, but as far as I can tell, it was Peter Smith's a logician in England, his understanding of a reasonable extension of Isaacson's conjecture. But I will make the conjecture completely explicit. So, in order to produce a rationally compelling proof of any true sentence, that's a sentence about arithmetic, so it's got the standard symbol set of arithmetic, but is independent of piano arithmetic, it's necessary to deploy concepts and structures of an irreducibly infinitary nature. And this would relate to my question earlier to Pei about whether NARS has the capacity to directly represent infinitary structures. Obviously, if the conjecture is true, then if NARS was limited in its ability to, if NARS was unable to allow for the direct representation of infinitely long, say, expressions, it would be limited. Of course, this conjecture may be false. All the evidence we have so far, and that's why I can issue it as a conjecture and still be standing here doing this with a recording happening, is that it's true. And you may say, well, wait a minute, I know something about logic and I know something about arithmetic. How in the world could there possibly be things independent of the axiomatization of arithmetic that are still not only true but provable? I thought Gödel told us there were ones that were true, but how can they be provable if they're independent of piano arithmetic? Well, you need to go back and look at what Gödel actually showed, which is sort of one of the major problems in the whole literature on Gödel's incompleteness theorems, because most of the time it's done informally and no one actually ever understands what's going on if they stop there with this kind of reading. In fact, there are a number of cases now of theorems of facts about arithmetic that are independent of piano arithmetic, but which have been proved. They have just been proved using techniques that might well not be reducible to what a Turing machine does. We just don't know. They're infinitary techniques, at least if we take what we see on the surface seriously. And the most famous, so far, example of this is Goodstein's theorem. This is something that Roger Penrose has talked about. I agree with his intuitions. I can't say I agree with the implementation of these intuitions. But the theorem is, if you take any natural number n, there's a particular sequence that will eventually terminate at 0 for all natural numbers. This was a complete shock to everyone that this sequence actually terminated at 0, but we have to accept the proof. The Goodstein sequence, we're not going to have time to go into it. I only have about 4 minutes left. But the Goodstein sequence is, by all accounts, an astonishingly fast-growing sequence when you pump in higher and higher natural numbers. So at 19, I forget, it's 10 to like 4,000 or something unbelievable like that at 19, and it got there very quickly. That's only 19. But it turns out that it eventually terminates at 0. By the way, here are the axioms of piano arithmetic. They're all expressed in first-order logic. So you cannot prove Goodstein's theorem from the piano axioms, even though it is an axiomatization of arithmetic. And that's an astonishing fact, but that's sort of, you know, it's like when Einstein, we were looking for something like the Perhelion effect to vindicate his math. You know, a lot of people said, oh, Gödel did this result and I have to accept it, but how in the world is it relevant? I'm somewhat skeptical. Well, we can't be skeptical any longer with cases like this. So, if this conjecture is true, and maybe NARS can be adjusted, and knowing how ingenious Pei is, I'm sure that's the case, there are a few people on record who are going to have a real problem with this. This is more philosophy of mathematics, but Lakoff says that basically all of the math that we do cognitively can be explained by a relatively simple metaphor, which is just, you know, something that never ends and we always iterate one more time. That math is insufficient to prove Goodstein's theorem. In fact, we have a proof that that math is insufficient to prove Goodstein's theorem. So he's going to have to figure out how to extend that metaphor. Let's back up, that wasn't nice. In the case of Darwin, Darwin argues in Descent of Man that all of the reasoning we do in the human case can be seen anticipated in the case generally of dogs and monkeys. And this looks very, very unlikely to me. In fact, by the way, to his great credit, he says, honestly, if you can come up with one counterexample, the entire edifice of evolution will collapse. He says that in that book. People talk about origin of the species, but actually that doesn't really talk about the human case. He saved that for a second book, which I find remarkably many people have not read. And then in current psychology, Barzilai is one of the simulationists. He argues that all of human cognition can be derived from relatively simple internal simulations. But that seems implausible in the infinitary case. So now we'll ignite and say those are, and we'll skip over this. So let me just very quickly go through our first stab at how this can be done in a working system in some sense. And I'm going to stop with this progression. I have a few. So the trick is this. Here we have an algorithm A star. Don't confuse this with navigation algorithm in gaming. A star generates a sub-algorithm that takes the number 0 and gives a result about the numeral 0, which is that there's a y that stands in some relationship expressed by phi. And this goes along, keeps going. We do this for 1 after doing it for 0. We do this forever, in theory, right? And what we know is that the algorithm is sound and will operate as advertised. And once we know that, we can prove our goal, which is that we can universally generalize to say for all x, right, for all numbers, phi is going to hold. This uses a particular rule called the omega rule, which is tailor-made for this, but it's a constructive, the little c there, it's a constructive version of the omega rule, which means in some sense it could be appreciated by a computer scientist because it's based in algorithms that we can wrap our heads around. Now, I will skip to this. You can't do this proof unless you use the theory of ordinal numbers, which are what those omegas there are there. Maybe some of you are familiar with ordinal numbers. It only uses here the first one, which is an ordinal number at the size of the natural numbers. But what was noticed is that there's a remarkable, this by the way is the Goodstein sequence going down for 19. First member, second member, third, fourth, fifth. And you can see how these numbers are growing astronomically and how they're bumped up. But notice that on the ordinal number side, we're actually decreasing. And once the analogy, this relates to analogical reasoning, once the analogy was seen here between the use of ordinal numbers on this side and the progression on the left-hand side, which is based in just ordinary arithmetic, combined with the theorem that on the ordinal side, this will eventually end up at 0. The insight in the proof was done. Yes, mathematics is deductive, but the discovery is not deductive. The discovery is often, for example, analogical. So I think with that, I will stop by going to my slide that says stop. All right, so it's about 50. Thank you.